So, starting with ratio, I just want to talk you through very quickly an example of how we simplify ratios, and you'll find they're very like fractions, and then an example question of how we share things in a ratio or how we split things in a ratio, or ratio of amounts is another way of saying that. So, simplifying first. Funnily enough, the first thing I think about when I'm simplifying ratios is actually fractions, because fractions are a thing that I also simplify. And I'm quite good at simplifying fractions, and I'm sure many of you are as well. So let's just quickly remind ourselves of how it works with fractions, and we'll see if we can apply some of that logic to how it works with ratios. So if I give myself a simple fraction, so let's do 4 over 10. This is something I know that can be simplified. How would I simplify it? Well, the rule is I look for a number that I can divide both numbers by. We call those a factor. And ideally, I want to try and find the highest factor possible because that's going to reduce the number of steps I have to make. And luckily, nice and simple, I can see that I can divide 4 by 2 and 10 by 2. So if I divide both top and bottom by 2, I'm going to end up with a new ratio. And in this case, it's 2 over 5. And all I'm going to do is I'm just going to check to make sure 2, 5, can I divide that by anything more? Well, I can divide it by 1, that won't change it. Nope, I'm done. I've fully simplified my answer. So that's fractions, and I know many people are familiar with those, they study them. Well, ratio questions work almost exactly the same way. So if you look here, all I'm going to do is I'm going to pick the same numbers and say, well, now I've got the ratio of 4 to 10, rather than 4 over 10. That makes it a ratio. And I'm going to simplify it the same way. I'm going to find a number that I can divide them both by, which is 2, we worked that earlier. And I'm going to divide them both by 2. And then underneath, 4 divided by 2 is 2, and 10 divided by 2 is 5. And hopefully what this shows you is that the ratio of 4 to 10 simplifies or is equivalent to the ratio 2 to 5. And it works exactly the same way. And I find that by just showing people this, showing them next to each other, color coding, you can see that really it works the same way. It's just like a fraction on its side. So if you're comfortable with simplifying fractions, you should become really quickly comfortable with simplifying ratios. So just to put those in words, it's quite clever, isn't it? Here's what I did earlier. Just like fractions, you find the highest common factor for both numbers and then divide them both by it. So in here, the highest common factor was 2, and here, the highest common factor is 2, and we end up with our answer. Just make sure at the end, in case you missed the highest common factor, you always just check your number to make sure, nope, there's nothing else I can divide them by. And if there's not, that means you're done and you have fully simplified it. So that's simplifying ratio. Hopefully nice and quick, not too hard. The next one is a sharing in the ratio or ratio of an amount question. And here's a classic example. There are 30 red and blue sweets in the ratio 2 to 3. How many red and blue sweets are there? And it might just ask how many red, it might just ask how many blue, and there's some even variations where it will give you the red and the blue and ask you to work out the total and things of that nature. But this, hopefully you'll see and you'll get a feel for how it works if we go through it together. So the first step is actually to work out what one share is. And let me talk to you a bit about what shares are. Well, first and foremost, there's a red sweet, or some number of red sweets, and some number of blue sweets. The order they appear in the text actually matters an awful lot. The fact that they said red first means that the 2 is the number of red shares, and the 3 is the number of blue shares. And it would obviously have a big difference if I swapped the red and blue round. It would mean I suddenly had more red or fewer blue. So the order in the passage works, and really my first step always is just to label my ratio. So a 30 red comes first, then there's some number of red and some number of blue, but red comes first and blue comes second. So I label it. The next thing I do, because this is how we're going to split it into shares, is we work out our total number. So we're going to add the 2 and the 3 together. That's this 2 and 3 to work out that we're going to be dealing with 5 shares. That's how many pieces we're going to split our 30 into. The next thing, funnily enough, is to work out the value of one share. What does one share equal? And the way we do that is we take the 30 and we divide it by the 5 shares that we worked out earlier. And what that will do is that will give us the value of one share. Now 30 divided by 5 is 6. So if I wanted to, I could write 6 is one share. In fact, probably the way I would set it out is I would say something like 1 share equals 6. What that means, I can now, if I know that I got 1 share's worth, I can work out any number of shares. So if I needed to work out the total, I would go back and do 6 times 5. In this case, I want to know how many red sweets there are and how many blue sweets there are. Well, for red sweets, because we've labelled clearly our ratio, I know that the red are going to get 2 shares. So red are going to receive 2 times 6, because it's 2 lots of 6, 2 shares. And that's going to equal 12. For blue, I'm going to have 3 shares, and each share is worth 6, so I'm going to have 3 times 6, which gives me 18. So I think I've worked out how many there are. I could choose to represent this underneath as saying, okay, well, that means I've split it into 12 to 18. But equally, it's fine just to say how many sweets you have as follows. But I do just want to check, have I done it correctly? And there's a really handy thing with ratio questions in that you can always check that you've split 30 sweets into 2 piles correctly by doing what? Well, checking that the 2 piles, if you put them back together again, you end up at 30. And if I had 20 pounds and I split it up and I put it back together and I suddenly had 5 pounds, something's gone wrong. So a little check, and I wouldn't necessarily write this out, I might just do it mentally, would be to add my 2 numbers together and just check, do I end up back at the total again? And in this case, if I add 12 and 18, or again here, I add 12 and 18, I do end up back at 30. So I know that I have properly shared out my sweets without mislaying any or accidentally eating any. So that would be how to work out your most basic ratio question. And I think if you can follow that, you'll be fine. And again, you can just write if you want to, I suppose. This would be the total. Quite often with these questions, you'll only be asked to work out 1. So if it did say only work out the red, you just write 12, or blue, you just write 18.